In 2023, lending clubs surveyed tens of thousands of American households. One number stood out: 36% of people earning over $100,000 a year reported living paycheck to paycheck. Not people who are struggling, not people making bad decisions, people doing everything right, saving consistently, advancing their careers, hitting milestones they were told to hit, and still, somehow, not getting ahead. Here's what that stat doesn't explain. Why does reaching a higher income level sometimes make the financial pressure worse, not better? The answer isn't spending habits. It isn't discipline. It's something far more mechanical, and almost nobody talks about it. The moment other people can see that you're doing well, the cost of staying well quietly goes up. Not because prices change, because expectations do. And expectations, once set, are almost impossible to walk back. That's what this video is about: the measurable, compounding cost of financial visibility. If you don't understand how this works, it keeps running in the background, draining the exact capital you worked hardest to build, completely silently, one social interaction at a time. My name is Alex, and if you've ever hit a savings milestone and somehow ended up with less freedom than before, stay with this, because the problem usually isn't what you spent, it's what you announced. I'm going to show you exactly how visibility becomes a tax and how to calculate what that tax has already cost you. Once you understand your financial acoustic signature, you'll stop broadcasting it without even thinking twice. That pattern has a name, and like most things that quietly cost you money, it runs on physics, not psychology. The same principle that keeps a submarine alive underwater is the same one that keeps wealth compounding in the dark. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. The most dangerous financial threats are rarely the ones you can see coming. A market crash shows up on every headline. A job loss hits your bank account the same week it happens. You feel it, you react, you adjust. But the mechanism that quietly drains wealth from people who are otherwise doing everything right, it leaves almost no trace, no notification, no statement line item. Just a slow, invisible erosion of the exact conditions that allow money to grow. To understand how this works, you need a mental model. And the best one doesn't come from finance at all. Think about how a submarine actually operates. Not the Hollywood version, the real engineering behind it. A submarine's survival depends entirely on one thing: staying undetected. It doesn't win by being the fastest vessel in the water. It doesn't win by having the most firepower. It wins by producing the smallest possible acoustic signature, the noise profile that sonar systems use to locate and target it. The moment it gets loud, it gets found. The moment it gets found, every advantage it had disappears. Now think about your wealth the same way. Money compounds most effectively when it is invisible, not hidden in a legally questionable sense, just quietly operating below the surface, out of other people's awareness, free from the social forces that activate the moment someone else knows it exists. An investment account nobody knows about keeps growing entirely on its own terms. It doesn't get volunteered for group dinners. It doesn't get mentally earmarked by a relative who just found out you're doing well. It doesn't trigger the quiet recalibration that happens in a friend group when one person visibly pulls ahead. That's the submarine doing its best work. Silent, deep, and completely free to move. Now here's what actually happens in practice. And this is where most people lose the thread. Say you're a project manager in Denver, 37 years old, earning around $96,000 a year. You've been disciplined for years. You drive a car that's 4 years old. You max out your retirement contributions. You've quietly built up $160,000 in investable assets, and you haven't made a big deal about any of it. Your submarine is running deep. Then one evening, at a casual get-together, someone asks how things are going, and you're feeling good, so you're honest. You mention the savings number. Maybe you mention you've been thinking about buying a rental property. Nothing dramatic, just a real answer to a real question. That is the moment the submarine surfaces. Not because you did anything wrong, not because the people around you are malicious, but because financial information, once shared, immediately begins reshaping the expectations, assumptions, and behaviors of everyone who heard it. The social environment around you quietly recalibrates. And that recalibration has a cost, one that doesn't show up anywhere obvious, but runs continuously in the background from that moment forward. Here's the part that should make you uncomfortable. The submarine analogy isn't just a useful image. It's actually a precise description of a mechanism that researchers have measured, quantified, and tracked across income levels and demographics. Currently, the data consistently show that visible wealth and invisible wealth, held by otherwise identical earners, produce meaningfully different outcomes over a 15 to 20-year window, not because of market conditions, not because of investment choices, because of what other people know. And the way that mechanism actually operates in daily life is more specific than most people expect. It doesn't arrive as one large expense. It arrives as a ratchet, clicking forward, one notch at a time, in a direction that only goes one way. Most people, when they hear the phrase lifestyle creep, picture someone buying a nicer car or upgrading their apartment, something visible, something they chose. But the version that actually does the damage is quieter than that, and it doesn't start with a purchase at all. It starts with a sentence. The word creep has always bothered me as a description of this phenomenon. Creep implies something slow, accidental, almost innocent, like moss growing on a wall. But what actually happens in people's financial lives is far more mechanical than that, and significantly harder to reverse. A better word is ratchet. A ratchet is a gear that moves in one direction only. You can advance it forward, one click at a time, but you cannot turn it back without breaking something. And every time you make your financial situation visible to the people around you, every upgrade you post, every milestone you mention, every restaurant you suggest where the entrees run $40, you click that ratchet one notch forward, not because you planned to, because you just established a new social floor. And social floors, unlike budgets, are not enforced by your bank account. They are enforced by the memory and expectations of everyone who witnessed you set them. This is the visibility ratchet. And once you understand how it works, you start seeing it everywhere. Here's how this looks in practice. Consider a financial analyst in Chicago, 31 years old, earning $112,000 a year. Call him Nathan. Nathan has been quietly building for 4 years. He has $183,000 saved. He lives in a modest apartment, and his spending is genuinely under control. His submarine, to use the frame from earlier, is running deep. Then Nathan gets a significant year-end bonus. He's proud of it, rightfully so. At a birthday dinner for a close friend, after a couple of drinks, he mentions the number. Not to brag, just because someone asked and he was feeling good. One sentence, one number. Within 6 months, the ratchet has moved 3 clicks forward. His friend group, now carrying a mental image of Nathan as someone who is clearly doing well, starts defaulting to nicer venues for group outings. Nathan never objects because objecting feels inconsistent with the version of himself he accidentally broadcast. His younger sister, who is between jobs, calls him before she calls anyone else, because Nathan is the one who mentioned a big bonus, so Nathan is the one who can help. A colleague planning a group trip automatically assumes Nathan is in for the higher tier accommodation option. Nobody is being manipulative. Every single one of these people is just responding rationally to the information Nathan gave them. That is the ratchet clicking forward, one notch at a time. Now let's put a number to it. Currently, behavioral finance researchers estimate that visible earners, people whose financial status is known within their immediate social circle, spend between $300 and $600 more per month than their invisible counterparts at equivalent income levels. Not on deliberate upgrades, on social maintenance. The dinners they don't push back on. The contributions they make because it would feel wrong not to. The loans that never quite get repaid and eventually just get written off. At $400 a month, over 30 years, at a 7% average return, that is $582,000. Gone. Not to a bad investment. Not to a market downturn. To the social contract Nathan accidentally signed at a birthday dinner. Surfaced submarines attract exactly this kind of cost. Quietly, consistently, with no single moment that feels catastrophic. But here's what makes this particularly difficult to escape. The pressure Nathan feels isn't only coming from the outside. Something is happening inside his own brain that is actively working against him. And it has a name. Researchers call it identity-consistent spending. And once you see how your subconscious enforces the image you broadcast, the number gets even harder to ignore. What Nathan is experiencing from his social circle makes intuitive sense. External pressure is easy to understand. People saw something, they adjusted their expectations, and now those expectations cost money. That part is logical. But there is a second layer to this that is considerably stranger. And honestly, when you see it clearly for the first time, it is more unsettling than the external pressure ever was. The more significant drain isn't coming from the people around Nathan. It's coming from Nathan himself. Once you publicly broadcast a financial identity, once the people in your life carry a mental image of what you earn, what you've saved, what kind of person you are financially, your own brain begins working overtime to protect that image. Not consciously, not through deliberate decisions can you observe and intercept. At the level of automatic, split-second judgment that happens before rational thinking even gets a vote. Behavioral economists call this identity-consistent spending. The core finding is straightforward and slightly disturbing. When your expressed identity and your actual behavior come into conflict, your brain experiences that as a threat, not a financial threat, a psychological one. And it resolves the conflict in the fastest way it knows how, by adjusting your behavior to match the identity, rather than the other way around. What that looks like in practice is subtle. Nathan is at a work lunch with two colleagues who know about the bonus. The server comes around. Nathan glances at the menu, registers that the mid-range option is perfectly fine, and then orders the more expensive one anyway. He didn't calculate that. He didn't weigh it. His brain just flagged the cheaper choice as inconsistent with the version of himself that exists in that room, and quietly steered him away from it. That happens dozens of times a month. Each instance feels like a free choice. The cumulative cost is anything but. Here is where it gets measurable. And I want to slow down here because this number deserves full attention. Assume you are 35 years old. You have $200,000 saved, which is a genuine achievement, and you are moderately visible, not extravagant, not posting your brokerage balance online, just known among your circle as someone who is doing well. The conservative estimate from behavioral finance research puts identity-consistent spending at around $400 a month, above what you would spend if your financial status were completely unknown. $400 a month does not feel catastrophic. That is the problem. It feels like a rounding error. Run it forward. $400 a month. Invested instead at a 7% average annual return over 30 years. The total is $582,000. You contributed $144,000 of that. The remaining $438,000 is compounding. You never got because the money was spent maintaining an image instead of sitting quietly in an account. That wealth was not lost to a recession. It was not lost to a bad decision you could point to and learn from. It was lost to a dinner you didn't really want, a hotel upgrade that felt expected, a loan to a friend that turned into a gift, multiplied across hundreds of small moments, over decades, because your brain was doing exactly what it was designed to do, keeping your behavior consistent with your stated identity. And look, I want to be honest about something here. This isn't a character flaw. The human brain's drive toward consistency is the same mechanism that makes you reliable, trustworthy, and coherent as a person. It just happens to be extraordinarily expensive when the identity you're protecting was broadcast by accident. The uncomfortable question is this: how many of your spending decisions this month were actually yours? And how many were your brain quietly paying the maintenance fees on an image you created for other people? That pressure, both external and internal, doesn't arrive fully formed overnight. It has a trigger, and that trigger is almost always a single visible purchase that expands the surface area of the life you now feel compelled to maintain. Economists have a name for this cascade. They traced it back to an 18th century philosopher, a windfall, and a scarlet dressing gown. And what he experienced then is quantifiably, measurably, happening to people in their 30s and 40s across the country right now. This is what researchers call the Diderot Effect. Before we go any further, I want to address the objection that is probably forming right now. You might be thinking that identity-consistent spending and the visibility ratchet sound like modern problems, products of Instagram and LinkedIn, and a culture that is uniquely obsessed with performance. And if that's the frame, then the solution is obvious. Just get off social media, be more mindful, and the problem goes away. But this mechanism is not modern. It is not a side effect of the algorithm. It has been documented in precise and almost painful detail for over 250 years. And the case that proves it involves a French philosopher, an unexpected windfall, and a piece of clothing. Denis Diderot was one of the most influential intellectuals of the 18th century. He co-created the Encyclopédie, one of the most ambitious publishing projects in European history. He was brilliant, widely respected, and for most of his adult life, completely broke. Then, in 1765, Catherine the Great of Russia purchased his personal library for a sum that was, by the standards of the time, a small fortune. For the first time in his life, Diderot had money, real money. The first thing he bought was a dressing gown, scarlet silk, beautifully made, the kind of garment that felt like an arrival. And for a brief moment, that was enough. Then he sat down at his writing desk. The desk, which had served him perfectly well for years, now looked completely wrong next to the robe. Shabby. Inconsistent. So he replaced it. The new desk made the curtains look dated, so he replaced those. The curtains made the rug look worn, so that went too. New art, new shelving, new chair. Within 12 months, one single visible purchase had forced him to replace virtually every object in his study. Not because he needed to, but because his brain could not tolerate the inconsistency between the new robe and the old everything else. He wrote about it himself in an essay titled, "Regrets for My Old Dressing Gown." The line that stayed with me is this. He described himself as a man who had been, without realizing it, master of his old dressing gown, and had now become the slave of his new one. That is the Diderot Effect. One visible upgrade expands the surface area of the life you feel compelled to maintain, and your brain scrambles to make the rest of the picture match. Now here is where it connects directly back to the Ratchet. The Journal of Consumer Psychology published research findings that making one visible luxury purchase makes a person 47% more likely to make a second, unrelated luxury purchase within 30 days. Not because their income changed, not because they consciously decided to upgrade their lifestyle, because the first visible purchase reset their internal baseline. It moved the floor, and everything below the new floor suddenly felt inadequate in a way it never had before. This is exactly what the Ratchet does socially. Diderot's effect does it internally. One click forward, and the baseline moves. The old normal starts to feel wrong, and the cost of returning to it stops feeling like discipline and starts feeling like deprivation. Currently, researchers estimate that a single high-visibility lifestyle upgrade, a luxury car, a premium vacation posted online, a home renovation shared with the wider social circle, triggers an average of 3 to 5 secondary purchases within the following 90 days. Not planned, not budgeted. Just the ecosystem catching up to the new baseline. That cascade is quiet. It feels like a personal choice at every single step. It rarely is. And if you think the cost of that cascade is difficult to measure in everyday spending decisions, wait until you see what happens when you run the actual numbers side by side across 2 careers. Because the price of servicing your submarine, the real, compounded, decade-spanning price, is considerably larger than most people are prepared to hear. Everything covered so far has been about the mechanism, how visibility spreads, how the Ratchet clicks forward, how your own brain enforces the image you broadcast. But mechanisms without numbers are just theories, and this particular theory has a price tag that most people are not prepared to see, written out in full. So let's actually run it. Start with a single case. A civil engineer in Minneapolis, 41 years old, earning $104,000 a year. Call him Victor. Victor spent a decade doing everything quietly and correctly. Practical apartment, 7-year-old car, never discussed money at family gatherings, not out of strategy, just habit. By his early 40s, he had built up $438,000 in savings and investments. Deep, silent, undetected. Then his mother passed away. The estate required a formal asset disclosure among the surviving children. Victor's numbers became visible to his siblings through a legal process he could not opt out of. His submarine surfaced entirely against his will. The shift was immediate. One sibling assumed Victor would absorb the larger share of estate legal fees. Another needed help covering a gap between jobs. A third approached him about a business idea requiring seed capital. None of these people were acting with malice. Each was simply responding to financial information they had just received, the way people naturally do. The moment Victor's number was known, it became a resource in other people's mental accounting. Over 20 months, Victor dispersed $63,000 in support, absorbed costs, and loans that quietly became gifts. Run that forward at a 7% annual return over 19 years. The accidental disclosure cost him just under $247,000 in lost compounding. One legal document, nearly $250,000. Not lost to a bad investment, lost to a single moment of involuntary visibility. Now look at the side-by-side comparison. because this is where the math becomes impossible to rationalize away. Two marketing directors, both 35, both based in the Southeast. Patrick earns $116,000, has $186,000 saved, and his financial situation is broadly known among friends, family, and colleagues. The visibility ratchet has him running $490 a month above his genuine baseline. Dinners he doesn't push back on, contributions that feel required, upgrades that match the expectation. Elliot earns $109,000, slightly less. He has $170,000 saved, also slightly less. But Elliot tells nobody. Forgettable car. Comfortable, unremarkable apartment. When the group picks a restaurant, he suggests somewhere mid-range, and nobody questions it because nobody has a reason to expect otherwise. Elliot runs about $60 a month above his baseline, entirely on his own terms. Same industry, similar income, similar starting point, completely different acoustic signatures. 15 years later, Patrick's net worth sits at $826,000. Solid and respectable. Elliot sits at $1.13 million. That $304,000 gap is the visibility tax, paid in small increments across hundreds of ordinary moments, none of which felt significant at the time. But here's the number that matters more than the net worth difference. At 50, Elliot gets offered a founding partner role at a brand consultancy. Half his current salary, real equity, work he actually wants to do. He takes it without hesitation. His invisible floor covers everything. Nobody around him notices. Patrick gets a version of the same call. He cannot move. 15 years of visible commitments have left him no room to maneuver. The opportunity closes. Invisible wealth does not just compound faster. It purchases optionality, the ability to make decisions based entirely on what you want, rather than what your visible life requires you to maintain, which makes the only remaining question a practical one. If the ratchet only moves forward, and the cost compounds this quietly, over this long a period, what does actually stopping it look like? That is where building your invisible floor comes in, and it is more specific and more actionable than most people expect. Knowing the cost of something and knowing how to stop it are two entirely different problems. And if the sections above did their job, the cost is clear. What is less obvious is what actually changing it looks like in practice, because the tempting conclusion is that the solution has to be as dramatic as the problem. It does not. The goal is not to go dark completely, not to refuse every social dinner or treat every conversation about money as a security threat. That kind of overcorrection creates its own friction, and frankly, it is exhausting to maintain. The goal is something more precise than that. It is to reduce your financial acoustic signature to the minimum necessary, deliberately, calmly, and without making a performance of it. There are 3 steps. Each one builds on the last, and each one deserves more than a passing thought. The first is to audit your visibility. Sit down and ask one honest question. Based on what you have said, posted, or implied over the last 12 months, what number would a reasonable person in your life assign to your net worth right now? Go through it carefully. What have you mentioned at dinners? What have you posted online? What do your car, your vacation, and your restaurant choices communicate to the people who are paying attention? Each of those is a data point that someone in your circle has already stored. Currently, behavioral researchers estimate that people update their financial assessments of close contacts within days of receiving new information, and those assessments are remarkably sticky. Once the number exists in someone else's head, it does not quietly disappear. Whatever picture your audit reveals, stop adding to it. Do not post the next milestone. Do not mention the next win. Let the submarine descend and give it time to clear the surface. The second step is to decouple your milestones from your social identity. This is harder than it sounds, because the impulse to share a real achievement is not vanity. It is human. You work towards something. You reached it, and you want it to mean something. That feeling is completely legitimate. The problem is not the feeling. The problem is the mechanism that sharing triggers in other people and in your own brain the moment you act on it. Find a private outlet, tell your partner, write it down, mark it in a way that is meaningful to you and invisible to everyone else. The milestone does not become less real because fewer people witnessed it, but it does become significantly less expensive. The wealthiest clients that financial planners work with consistently share the least about their finances socially, not because they were instructed to, but because they figured out, usually after one costly lesson, that sharing a number is functionally identical to handing someone a lever to your money. The third step is to build an invisible liquid reserve floor. This is a specific number, one that only you know, held liquid, accessible, and completely outside the awareness of your social circle. A practical starting target is 3 to 6 months of your actual spending, not your income, sitting in a high-yield account with no shared visibility. No joint statements, no casual mentions. It simply exists. The purpose of this reserve is not purely financial. It is psychological. When you know the floor is there, the social pressure that drives identity-consistent spending loses most of its grip. You can sit at a group dinner knowing you could pay for the entire table and quietly order from the middle of the menu because you have nothing to prove and no image to protect. Silence stops feeling like scarcity. It starts feeling like a choice. That is what an invisible floor actually buys. Not just security, a specific kind of freedom that visible wealth, for all its apparent advantages, rarely provides. And that realization leads directly to the only question worth closing on. Here's what this all comes down to. You are not falling behind because you are doing something wrong. You are falling behind because the moment other people can see you pulling ahead, the cost of staying ahead quietly increases. The ratchet clicks forward. The baseline shifts. Your own brain starts spending money to protect an image you created for an audience that was never supposed to have that information in the first place. That is the mechanism. It is not a character flaw. It is not bad luck. It is a system, and it runs on your visibility. A few things worth carrying forward. Wealth compounds fastest when it is invisible. Social floors, once set, are almost impossible to lower without friction. Identity-consistent spending is automatic, not conscious, which means the only reliable way to stop it is to stop broadcasting the identity. And optionality, the ability to make real choices about your own life, is the thing that silent compounding actually buys. The question worth sitting with is this: what have you already broadcast? And what is that broadcast quietly costing you every single month? There is a related question that deserves its own video. If visibility is this expensive, why do financial institutions consistently encourage you to make your wealth legible to them? And what does that cost you on top of everything else? If that question landed, share this with someone who needs to hear the mechanism explained. And if you want to keep pulling back the curtain on how money systems actually work, subscribe, because that is exactly what this channel is for.